The story begins with a lady named Amelia who lives alone in a grand, slightly eerie mansion with her two small children. Despite the beautiful surroundings, there's an unsettling stillness in the air. As we get a glimpse into Amelia's daily life, we see her carefully feeding her children milk. But just before she serves them, she adds a few drops of an unusual chemical into their drinks. This simple action raises immediate questions about her intentions. After doing this, Amelia leaves one of her children in the room and steps out with the other. The camera then cuts to a man lurking nearby, watching the mansion closely. Seizing the opportunity, this man sneaks into the room and kidnaps Amelia's child. Outside, Amelia is settling into her car, seemingly oblivious to what's happening inside. But as she prepares to leave, she catches a glimpse of the man running with her child. She's hit with the horrifying realization that her children are being kidnapped. Amelia's eyes flash with an unnatural whiteness as her pupils completely turn white. This transformation is sudden and shocking, giving Amelia an air of something otherworldly. Fueled by this newfound energy or rage, she begins to run faster than ever before, chasing down the man who is attempting to take both of her children. Amelia's supernatural speed and determination seem to overpower the kidnapper, who realizes that he can't easily escape from her. In the ensuing struggle, Amelia manages to snatch one of her children back. The other child, however, is left behind as the kidnapper races off in his vehicle. We see an older boy sitting alone in a small apartment in New York City. This boy is Edward, and he's now in his 20s. His life seems normal enough until he receives an unexpected phone call. The caller identifies themselves as part of a city survey team and informs Edward that they have no record of his birth date or any information about his biological parents. Edward finds this odd, as he had always known he was adopted but never questioned his origins too deeply. The call leaves him feeling unsettled. Edward returns home to his girlfriend, Riley, who has been his constant support throughout his search for his family. Riley, sensing that Edward needs some cheering up, surprises him with a gift, a new DNA testing kit. The device claims to detect not just genetic heritage, but even distant relatives. Riley knows that Edward has always yearned to find his roots, so she hopes this gift will finally provide some answers. Later that night, Edward decides to use the device, and within a few hours, he receives a notification that his DNA has matched with someone named Manuel, a young man from Portugal. Curious and excited, Edward decides to send a message to Manuel through the app. At that moment, Edward catches sight of a dark shadow in the corner of his room, but when he looks again, it's gone. He dismisses it as a trick of the light. The next morning, Edward receives a call from Manuel, and their conversation confirms something astonishing. Manuel is his twin brother. Shocked and elated, Edward decides to travel to Portugal with Riley to meet his newfound family. Edward and Riley arrive in Portugal and make their way to the location that Manuel provided. On the way, they stop to ask an elderly couple for directions and show them a photo of the mansion. The couple's faces pale when they see the mansion, and they urgently tell Edward and Riley to leave and never go there. The couple's reaction unnerves them, but Edward's determination to find his family drives him forward. Upon arriving at the mansion, they are greeted by Manuel, who looks exactly like Edward. The two brothers are overwhelmed by their striking resemblance and bond instantly. As Manuel takes them on a tour of the mansion, Edward notices a picture of a woman in the hallway. Manuel reveals that the woman is their mother, Amelia. That night, Manuel brings Edward to meet their mother, Amelia. The encounter is surreal for Edward, who has only seen her in the old photograph. But Amelia, though still beautiful, looks strangely old yet not as aged as she should be. There's an uncanny aura around her, and Edward feels both excited and wary. Edward shares his impressions of his mother with Riley, but Riley brushes it off as Edward simply being overwhelmed by the reunion. Riley is just happy that Edward has finally found his family. The next day, Riley meets Amelia for the first time. Their conversation is brief, but it leaves Riley with an odd feeling. Later that night, Riley overhears a conversation between Manuel and Amelia while passing by their room. Curious, Riley uses a voice translation app to understand their Portuguese conversation. She hears Amelia telling Manuel that he will soon have children and that after that, she will select him as her main son. The conversation is disturbing and suggests that something sinister is at play. Just then, Amelia whispers to Manuel that Riley is listening outside their door. Startled and terrified, Riley runs back to her room and tells Edward everything. However, Edward dismisses her concerns, believing she must have misunderstood the situation. Riley's suspicions deepen when she finds an old box in the mansion containing photos of a couple. The man in the picture looks remarkably like Edward. The woman bears a striking resemblance to Amelia. The realization dawns on Riley that the man in the photo could be Edward's father. She decides to confide in Edward, but she's afraid he won't believe her without proof. That night, Riley has a nightmare in which she sees Amelia in a monstrous form rifling through her suitcase. When Riley wakes up, she finds her clothes neatly folded, something she hadn't done herself. This eerie experience convinces her that something supernatural is happening in the mansion. Riley shares her concerns with Edward. He remains skeptical. Edward wanders into the nearby forest and stumbles upon a rundown cottage. Inside, he finds a man in distress, dragging himself across the floor. He collapses upon seeing the man. When Edward regains consciousness, he's back in the mansion, with Manuel sitting beside him. Manuel offers Edward a drink. Without Edward noticing, he slips the same chemical Amelia used earlier into the beverage. Slowly, Edward begins to lose control over his own mind and body, just as Amelia's children did at the beginning of the story. Manuel's eyes turn completely white. Edward realizes that Manuel possesses the same supernatural abilities as their mother. Riley continues her investigation and discovers a book about a Portuguese witch who consumes her children to stay young. She rushes to warn Edward, but when she tries to convince him to leave, he reacts angrily. Riley is heartbroken, realizing that Manuel and Amelia have somehow manipulated Edward. Desperate, Riley seeks help from the elderly couple they met earlier. The woman, whose name is Vieira, finally agrees to tell Riley everything. Vieira shares a series of old photographs, one of which shows a man who looks exactly like Edward. Vieira reveals that this man was Amelia's son, Arthur, and the woman in the photo was her daughter, Felia. Arthur and Felia were deeply in love, but Amelia, a powerful witch, came between them. According to Vieira, Amelia seduced her own sons and used them to create more children. She would kill her daughters but keep her sons, raising them until they were old enough to continue the cycle. Amelia did this to maintain her youth and power through black magic. Vieira claims that Manuel is under Amelia's control, and that Edward is at risk of becoming her next victim. Riley decides they need to leave immediately, but Manuel blocks their way. Riley manages to convince Edward of the truth by showing him the photos and telling him Vieira's story. Edward finally agrees to leave, but before they can escape, Manuel attacks Riley, revealing that he has been fully brainwashed by Amelia. Riley runs back to the mansion to find Edward, but she arrives just in time to witness a horrifying sight. Amelia, in her monstrous form, is attempting to get intimate with Edward, using her powers to manipulate his mind. After finishing off her job, Amelia goes back to her room. Riley takes Edward and leaves. As Riley and Edward make their way out of the mansion, Amelia catches up to them. She tries to stab Riley with a knife, and it looks like all hope is lost. Suddenly, the imprisoned man from the cottage, Arthur, arrives and tackles Amelia, sacrificing himself to save his son. Riley and Edward manage to escape, leaving behind the mansion and the horrors within it. In the final scene, Amelia is shown looking youthful once again, holding a baby in her arms. It's unclear whether the child belongs to Edward or Manuel, but it's clear that Amelia's dark rituals have succeeded once more. The camera lingers on her haunting smile as the screen fades to black. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want more deep dives into psychological thrillers, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated. See you next time.